Hello and welcome to my latest video, this time focusing on the pink tentacles of the Death Shroud terminators that I've been painting. You saw the colours on the screen there, but just to go through them quickly, there is Vallejo model colour black, P3 Morrow White, and by Games Workshop there's Rhinox hide, Sunz Scarlet and Emperor's Children. The Sunz Scarlet is used later on, it's not on the wet palette in the top right, that's purely for glazing. Looking at the wet palette in the top right, the colours on the left side are Rhinox hide with a small amount of Emperor's Children. Below that is straight Emperor's Children. Next one is Emperor's Children mixed with white, and below that is mainly white with a small amount of Emperor's Children. That's the final highlight colour. The right hand side of the palette, the top colour is straight Rhinox hide, below that straight black, and below that is white. I'm painting the small tentacle around the sensor bomb thing on the side of the Terminator. I'm focusing on the shading at the moment, and the reason for that is that it's easier to paint the pink lines and details onto the tentacle if it's a bit darker. The base colour, obviously it was pink before I started, that was just plain straight Emperor's Children. There I'm painting the tip of the tentacle black. It's quite hard to see because it's such a small area. Later on in the video I do switch to another set of tentacles, so you get a chance to see it again because it is such a small area that I'm painting. So what I'm doing here is carrying down the black quite far down, and then I'm using the Rhinox hide mixed with Emperor's Children to blend that in and create a transition as you go further down. The handy thing with having the paints mixed is that I can oh, my phone's talking to me. The handy thing with having the colours mixed is that I can create quick transitions and do some wet blending on the model, which you can't see because I put the base in the way, but if you're quick when you put the paint down, while it's still wet, if you pick the next colour in the transition you can blend them on the model. Some people have separate brushes so that you get a clean brush to blend it to help control the transition. It really depends what you want to do, but it's a quick method. It doesn't have to be a perfect blend, because once you put the details on, that will help to hide any inconsistencies in the transitions. So you can see I'm using the Rhinox hide and Emperor's Children paint to really darken it down and add some definition, so that the central area of the tentacle, the middle area, is the main focal point. It helps because by doing that, then it looks like the light's catching that area, and makes it seem like it's curving into the shadows. You can see how the nice black tip of the tentacle contrasts nicely with the oxidized copper of the sensor as well. So you always got to think about that when you're painting things, on how the colours interact with the objects around them, not just painting the thing that you're painting to make it look nice, but to make it complement the areas around it. So what I'm doing now is just using straight Emperor's Children. I feel like it needs another name, like Emperor's Children Pink. But I'm just painting in some line detail. Now the model has segments sculpted into the tentacle. However, I want the tentacle to be more detailed than the sculpting is. So for the first section that's just near the black tip of the tentacle, I have used the sculpted section, but as it gets closer to the pink, I've put more vertical lines, and there are segments of the sculpted on. It just makes it look more interesting, I think, rather than having evenly spaced segments all the way along. I've done this to lots of the other tentacles on the models as well, so later in the video I'll be showing you some of those as examples. It's quite a tricky tentacle to get to, this one, but unfortunately the previous video that I recorded for this purpose went terribly wrong and was unusable, so I had to do it again. The pipes coming from the backpack going to the side would have been nice, but then they don't have the black tip transition on the end, so I had to use this one. It's important to remember when painting on these details that you go as far around as you can on the lines. It can be tricky if you want to paint the line all the way around, because you'll probably end up missing the connection as you come back around at the top. So don't worry. For this section, obviously it's connected at the back, so you wouldn't have to worry about that. But if it was one of the tentacles that are free floating, you do have to be a bit more careful and keep the line consistent all the way around, and make an effort not to turn it into a twirl. You might notice that I'm also reversing the motion of the paintbrush so that I can get those lines going up really far underneath the tentacle, because you can only paint so far down before the brush leaves the model, but by pulling the brush towards you, you can get right up underneath, and then it's like a reverse movement to get right behind it. So now we're highlighting those lines that you've just put on. The highlight area will focus more on just the bright section of the tentacle. And you're just going over the lines that you've already painted on. Now, because these are just highlight points, you don't have to go all the way around. So the first line is kind of mapping out the pattern, and that is like the creating the detail, and this is highlighting the detail. So I'm just tidying up those little marks, because although they are tiny, it does look better if they're neat. You might notice that the tip of the paintbrush I'm using, it's not super fine. Again, it's one that I've worn the tip off. I have quite a lot of those. They don't tend to last very long without my paint. But having the tip slightly wider allows you to make wider lines more easily. It's not always ideal to make super thin lines, so you can use newer brushes for the finest lines that you want to do and older brushes for the thicker lines. Right, so what happened there was that there's a join line, which is slightly in the shadows underneath the exhaust vent on the back there, and it was really bugging me, so it now looks a mess under there, but I got some glue and I filled in that gap. I'll paint over the section and you won't be able to notice that it was a mess, but it was annoying me while I was painting the video. So what I just did there was use a little bit of the Rhinox hide and Emperor's Children mix and blended over some of those thin lines. And now what I'm doing is I'm using the highlight colour and I'm painting on a light mark. This is like a light reflection. So while the previous lines that I painted on were supposed to be details that were sculpted onto the model that I've added to and then highlighted, this is just light catching that section, and it helps to first of all emphasize the draw the eye towards the center of the tentacle even more, so that it creates contrast between the light and dark, but also make it look a little bit shiny, because what I intend to do at the very end of the project is put a slight gloss coat on top of these tentacles as well, which I'll be posting photographs for you to see, while keeping the rest of the model very matte. It's not matte at the moment, but it will be. And then so there's other areas on the model as well that will also be glossy, and then it'll create nice contrasts between the materials. So after I've painted on that little highlight line, and then going back over some of the details, those little detail lines, to make sure that they weren't too obscured by the highlight line. I realise it's very small in the video. It was a bit tricky for me to focus on it, but don't worry, because in a few minutes I'll be going on to the next set of tentacles, which should hopefully be a bit larger. So what I'm doing now is just quickly painting on some yellow pustules. I wasn't intending to do that during the video, but I noticed they were there and they were bugging me. I used Avalon Sunset, which is a Games Workshop base paint. You don't need to use that particular yellow. In fact, a more dull yellow would probably be more suitable, but I just wanted to pick out those details while I was doing this section. And what I'm doing here is a highlight point on the black tip. And you have to be careful on this, because if you put too much paint down, you'll make it stop looking black. It still wants to look like it's black. This is just a highlight. Whereas the tentacle itself is pink transitioning into the black. This is just the black with a shiny tip. And also because the tip is closer to the center of the tentacle. You see the line kind of, it lines up with the center of the tentacle, so that's why that point needed to be highlighted. Now what I'm going to do here is make a glaze to finish off the tentacle. This is where the Evil Sunz Scarlet comes in, so you see it's just a small amount of paint, and then I keep adding water, and it's just straight water, you don't need anything else for a glaze. And you can see it's becoming very, very runny. I'm trying to make it balance on top of my palette. There we go. And there we can see a clear shot of the tentacle as it is at the moment. So what I do when I put the paint onto the brush before I apply it to the model is I run it over some kitchen towel. It takes off the majority of the paint, so it's just a very thin line. If you put the paintbrush in the paint and then applied it now, that would be a wash, and the paint would run. It wouldn't stay on the tentacle, it would run all into the shadows. It would look terrible. This allows the paint to just lay on the surface that you put it on. It will dry very quickly. What you can't see in the video, although you should be able to see actually, is the paint is drying. So I'm blowing on it to improve the evaporation of the water. Now you might notice as I apply the red and then I leave it, as I apply it, it looks quite dark. Then as it dries, it fades away. That's the effect of the evaporation. And because there is that detail sculpted into the model, the paint still kind of seeks out those little details and draws itself in there. And so as it dries, it is kind of working a little bit as a wash. I'm not taking as much paint off as I could, but I like the effect of the red shading in in between the sections of these pink lines. You'll also notice that I'm only putting the red glazes on the left and right hand side of the tentacle. I'm not going over the pink highlight in the middle because I still want that pink to pop out and contrast with the other colours, rather the other tones. So I'm just using a little bit of white just to pick out the fine highlight. Apologies for the camera shake, that was my head smacking against it. So it's just a case of just picking out that final little highlight line to really make the lighting stand out there. Now, as you remember, when I painted on the two little yellow pustules, they're a bit hard to see in the video, but you've got to be careful not to obviously paint those pink again. And there we go, there's a final straight on shot. Because it is such a small section to paint, it is hard to get the angle perfectly right. But anyway, here's so those were the original tentacles I was going to paint. As you can see, they would have been much easier to show you on. But I didn't paint the back of them at the time, so now I'm going to paint the back of them. And you're going to see the same process again, but these tentacles are a little bit larger. Now you might notice that I'd already put the transition colour on, so the tip of the tentacle is black going into the Rhinox hide and Emperor's Children, then going back into Rhinox hide in the dark shadows where the tentacles come out from. Just trying to tweak the lighting so you can see into the shadow. Unfortunately, this is also a little bit recessed, but there's still more for you to see on a larger scale. Now, particularly on the largest tentacle above the uppermost of the two, you can see the segments quite clearly on these, and you see that they're large segments. Whereas if you paid attention when you saw the front of the tentacle, I painted lots and lots of these lines because I wanted all the extra detail. And what happens is when you paint all these extra lines in, it camouflages the detail on the model, and so you don't actually notice the segments, and you think that the lines that you paint on are actually how the details are meant to be. So don't be afraid when you see a model with the details painted onto it to tweak how the design is intended for them to look just with painting. You don't always have to model things. And the benefit of having those bumps on is if you actually leave the gaps in between the lines where those bumps go into the recesses, it actually makes them look even darker. So you get these nice variations in dark lines between some of them being on the raised areas of the bumps and some of them being in the narrow, in the recessed areas. So it doesn't all look uniform. It makes it look much more organic and interesting. Almost like an earthworm. Speaking of which, I can see a maggot there on the cloak that I've got to paint in. So you see the lines as I paint them, they're very smooth. And because the paint is, it's not an incredibly opaque paint. So it takes 2 or 3 strokes of the brush to get a clear line. So you have to be very slow and steady with each brush mark. And also, I'm not just using the tip of the brush, but the side of the tip. So the brush runs along and then trails off onto the tip. You can see here as well how I started off painting the stripes from one angle, and then as I slowly rotate the model, I carry that on going round and underneath the tentacle. As you can see, it's already looking much more detailed after putting just these straight Emperor's Children lines on. Now these large tentacles, they have some spikes on. I decided not to paint those as yellow pustules. It looked a bit weird to have the spikes as yellow as well, so I've just painted those as pink highlights. I did forget to paint the red glaze at the end of this video on these tentacles, but you saw that on the previous one. I'll also add a photo at the end so you see the tentacles clearly from the front that does have the red glaze on, so you can see how that affects the look of these. sections. It's the same process on the small tentacle that you saw at the beginning of the video. So I'm picking out the highlights in the middle. These highlights are going straight over the top of the previous lines, so exactly on top of them. This isn't a case of randomly putting more lines on top. They have to go exactly on top of the lines that you've already painted as highlights. If you put random lines on top, it'll start breaking up all these lines. There won't be any gaps in between. It'll look messy, which could also be a technique of like a look that you're going for, but in this particular case you need to make sure that those lines are straight on top if you want to replicate this look. And again, the highest highlight sections are going to be in the middle of these tentacles where the light would hit them more, and also to draw to create that contrast next to the dark tips of the tentacles. So this final highlight colour, the paint is a little bit thicker than you might be expecting. You should notice that the paint on my wet palette doesn't run. Not for this section, because I want the paint to make very sharp, definite marks. You can see here as the lines go on, it's the very strong lines. There's no softness to them. If you have thinner paint, it doesn't make such a sharp line, and it starts to go more towards the glaze, and so that they almost look transparent, the lines. This way the line is very opaque. And you can really see now well, at least you could, you could see the contrast in tone between the dark on the tip of the tentacle and the light in the middle. Now, as I was just saying, that the paint was quite thick, I'd actually let it dry out a bit, so I'm just adding a bit of water to it, but it's still quite thick. I can't give you exact consistencies for ratios of paint to water, because I've mentioned this before, but each paint is an individual, so you have to kind of learn it yourself. But this paint is probably something like double cream. It is quite thick. So what I'm painting on now is the highlight line, which isn't highlighting the detail but adding a light catching the tentacle. So as I mentioned before, I'm going to paint these a bit glossy as well, and it will help to enhance that shiny wet look. You can see now as the light catches it, it emphasizes the curve of the tentacle, like that tubular shape. And as with the small tentacle that I painted before, just painting the tip of it again to create the light point hitting the tip, and also just a little bit more contrast, and just because it looks cool. I I've said this before as well, don't always follow stringently the light to make it realistic. Sometimes it's just fun to paint things on because they look good. And there you see that contrast against the dark tip, just having that white light reflecting on it. There you can see the well, you briefly saw the tentacles from the front. So there was the champion. You can see I've got lots to do still on the armor and everything, but you can see the pink tentacle tubes and things that I've painted on there. It's exactly the same process. And here is the other model. You can see that I've painted on the long tubes connecting the weapon to the backpack. You can see how it really focused on the middle section to make it the light look like it was catching it. So there's a clear look at the tentacles on for the final piece. I hope you've enjoyed what you could see of this video, and thank you for watching.